Yeah, I think something that kept coming up throughout the panel and throughout the day really is that there are two sides to this. One side is that we are living longer lives, and at least the evidence is somewhat more mixed on the health side, but we are mostly living healthier lives as well. And that's a good news story. That's something that we should all be happy about. And even thinking about the kind of aging society and shifting population structure, maybe there's a good news story for young people around there, that they're now in a very different labour market to their parents or their grandparents, that they're going to live in a world where there's almost a labour shortage. And that could be quite good for wages, and that could really give them a lot of opportunities that maybe they wouldn't have had because they're not having to compete with as many other workers. But then the other side of that is we do have this kind of more doom and gloom narrative, which is still very much present. In particular, I think with policymakers more on the fiscal side, there is a lot of worry, for good reason, around things like how are we going to pay for people's pensions going forward. The portion of the government budget going to health expenditure is getting bigger and bigger, and it's projected to keep increasing. How are we going to manage that if our tax base is shrinking and if our population is shrinking? There are different solutions we can think about there, but that does seem to be a difficult problem, especially from that fiscal policy side, thinking about things like sustainability of government finances. But there are really these two sides of looking at the story. One, from an individual perspective, it's great news, and there maybe are some kind of social benefits there as well. But at the same time, there is this fiscal challenge which institutions as they are set up now are going to struggle to deal with. Yeah, so on the methodological side, a few things came up kind of several times throughout the panel of things that we need to do as macroeconomists, both practitioners, researchers, policymakers, to make macroeconomics in a fit state to deal with these issues. One of those was rethinking the life cycle model. So usually in most models, macroeconomic models, if we include a life cycle, it's a very simple one. There's kind of an education phase, there's a working phase, and then there's a retirement phase. And actually in that retirement phase, nothing really happens apart from you just eat what you had saved, and then that's the end of it. Perhaps there's a little bit around what kind of assets I should buy or something like that, but it's really quite simple. So as we go and as we move into a world where people are living longer and we're getting shifts in the population distribution, we need a more flexible, we need a more continuous life cycle model. And perhaps one that involves more, rather than a three-stage life, more than that. So perhaps you want to go back to education later on, or perhaps you have different types of career, that you have your kind of your career until you're 55 or something like that, and then you transition into a different career for the last decade or so of your life in order to be able to keep working in a way that you enjoy and you find valuable. So rethinking that life cycle model was a really important thing that came up a lot. Another was thinking more about heterogeneity. So can we adapt our macroeconomic toolboxes to introduce that heterogeneity across people? That's really important when we're thinking about aging. We know that people are heterogeneous in all sorts of ways, but one of the biggest ways in which we differ from each other is how we age. If you think about a 65-year-old, that could be someone who's in really poor health, clearly cannot work anymore, but it could be someone in the prime of their life who's perhaps as productive as they've ever been, is running marathons, things like that. So we can't have a modeling structure that just treats all 65-year-olds the same. We need to introduce that heterogeneity. That comes with some technical challenges around modeling, but there are also some kind of empirical challenges, some measurement challenges. How can we break down into a few numbers what the difference is between that very healthy 65-year-old who's running marathons and the 65-year-old who can barely walk? We need to be able to quantify those inner things and relate those to economic outcomes. And that requires some measurement and some data that it's really difficult, measuring some things that is really difficult to measure. So that's something else that I think we need to build on methodologically that came up across our speakers in the panel, improving that data and our modeling capacity to deal with differences across people. So I think one gap that was highlighted during the panel was understanding the link between health and age and productivity. So a lot of economic forecasters think a lot about labour force participation and hours worked in relation to age and health. And it's a difficult problem, but we do a relatively good job probably at working out whether you're likely to be employed at a certain age or whether you've got a certain health condition and how many hours you're meant to work. But productivity is a really important issue there, and it's much harder to pin down. So it's certainly good if people work for longer and work more hours and they're employed for longer, but if they're not being productive in that extra time, perhaps we're just working them for no benefit, and that's not really necessarily going to increase GDP or help with government budget balances or anything like that. So that link between health, age, and productivity, rather than just health, age, and labour force participation, is a bit of a gap here in that literature that I think both on the policy side and the research side, there was an acknowledgement that that's something that we need to focus on and that we need to fill. So one thing that really surprised me in the panel was a discussion around the increasing health expenditure that are projected in a lot of countries, the UK, but many other countries as well. To what extent is that due to shifting demographics, and to what extent is it due to other factors? And there was a bit of disagreement throughout the room on that issue. Some people saying it's really just demographics. It's just the fact that we're going to have more older people, and that really is going to drive up those healthcare costs. But then there were some other people who were presenting evidence that actually this is more about how, as income increases, people demand more from the health sector, or other factors along those lines. So exactly what is driving those increasing healthcare costs, I think, is something that there wasn't really consensus on the room, which kind of surprised me, given that my assumption coming in was this is all about demographics. Something else that I think was kind of surprising throughout the day was the differences between countries' experiences here. And I think there's a lot so some countries are at different stages of a demographic transition, but also their labour markets work very differently. So things like early retirement or female labour force participation, things like that work very differently in different countries. And I think in a way that shows us that there's an opportunity to change the way our societies age, that these kind of things can be malleable, because if different countries are dealing with the demographic transition in different ways, there are clearly things that we might be able to do in order to make the most of our longer lives and these demographic transitions. So those cross-country differences, I think, are super interesting because they can show us how we could maybe change our institutions, the way our economy works, to make the most out of the opportunity of these longer lives.